With the imminent release of 007 First Light, I found myself casting my mind back to Bond games, and it made me realise just how long it's been since the last one, which was 007 Legends in 2012. It was a weird amalgam of a few different films told in flashbacks, and loosely tied to the film at the time, which was Skyfall. And in fact, there's a whole controversy about Legends, because for some reason or another, the final mission didn't ship on the disc, so the game just ended without any closing mission, and you needed to download it if you wanted to properly finish the game. Certainly not the series' finest hour by any stretch of the imagination. But what it did remind me of was the Activision Bond games, the ones made on the Call of Duty engine, and for the most part, what you could reductively call COD clones. The first of which was Quantum of Solace, developed by Treyarch. Yeah, the same Treyarch that made Call of Duty World at War and Black Ops. In fact, Quantum of Solace came out just a few weeks before World at War did, so to say there's some COD lineage is a bit of an understatement, really. Anyway, the game came out at the back end of 2008, and it's obviously a tie-in for Quantum of Solace, the film, which, if you lived in the UK, actually came out in cinemas on the same day. And it's also the first Bond game I ever played, so to some degree it's my favourite, if not because of pure nostalgia, but because I was young, impressionable, and James Bond was, and still is, pretty damn cool. But if we look back, is Quantum of Solace actually a good game?
Hello?
Well, let's find out, shall we? The game picks up directly where Casino Royale ends, and the first mission is the game's version of what takes place before the car chase in the opening of Quantum of Solace. And no, for some reason the car chase isn't something that's played, but it is what they use for the typical Bond intro for the game, and for the most part it's a bit rushed feeling and definitely not the great first impression that you would hope for when it comes to showing something that's well put together. It serves its purpose, I suppose, and to be honest, it isn't really that bad, and at least the game front loads Quantum of Solace, because for the rest of the game it's practically all Casino Royale, to the tune of more than half. I didn't really notice that in 2008, but looking back it seems a bit odd that Quantum of Solace the game is more like 60% casino missions, more like Casino of Solace or something like that. But you'll get no complaints from me, because the missions from Casino are some of the best in the game, which is good, because that's practically the whole game. But I did get a bit curious as to why it's so casino-heavy and light on the namesake, and supposedly it's because the Quantum script went through a load of strikes and had endless issues getting written, and one of the things I did read was that Daniel Craig actually wrote a lot of the film, which, as an actor, is unusual, so God knows what happened. There was a load of writer strikes at the time, and Quantum of Solace was one of the things that got hit the most, I guess, because it's one of the biggest films of the year. And then on top of that, Activision didn't have a casino tie-in game, which is something they supposedly wanted, so they decided they'd fix it by slamming both together in 2008. So it's a mixture of messing up with the Quantum script and probably some issues with the Bond license when it came to Activision getting the rights. So when it comes down to it, you're left with this weird amalgam of a game which is basically, but not entirely, something that probably should have released alongside the film in 2006. But Casino Royale is my favourite Bond film, and you'll get no complaints from me, even if it is a bit jarring to play through a game that isn't totally coherent or chronological. And if you're familiar with the films, it'll make a lot more sense. And if you're not, you're probably not playing a Bond game, so either way it's fine, I guess. Anyway, on to the game, and like I said, the casino missions are my favourite, and before I get on to talking about the gameplay more broadly, I'm going to go through the missions to give you an idea of how much the game's content I think is actually decent, because it isn't actually that long of a game, so you'll blow through it pretty quick, and here's what you can expect as far as I'm concerned. The game kicks off with White's Estate, a tutorial light opening that introduces the core loop of shooting, cover, hand-to-hand combat, and hacking cameras, though you'll quickly find that the hacking isn't nearly as useful as it should be, and usually just amounts to unlocking doors and looking at cameras which don't really provide you much information at all. It's a serviceable start, and one that introduces you to all of the game's mechanics pretty softly, and it's decent enough, I suppose. But the game stumbles pretty quickly with Mission 2, which is Sienna. Despite being a high-stakes rooftop chase, the stop-start nature of the combat makes it feel a bit at odds with the theme, and it's capped off by a pretty wooden-feeling quick-time event, which you'll see plenty more of as the game progresses. When the game stops trying to be a blunt instrument, it actually starts to find some degree of a soul, specifically with the stealth becoming an option in Mission 3, which introduces creeping through the underbelly of the Opera House using a silencer and solving some basic environmental puzzles, which really makes you feel like a secret agent, which is the whole point of the game. And I'd say that secret agent Bond vibe peaks around the Miami Airport and Casino Royale hotel missions, which I'd consider the best parts of the game. The airport encourages total stealth through the data centers, followed by some quite well scripted action, while the hotel perfectly blends the quiet infiltration with iconic moments from the film, where you'll see another QTE action scene, which is a little bit better than the first one because it's one of the cool moments from the film. And there's also a pretty interesting thing done with this dual perspective, where you can see yourself from the outside and what the guard can see, so you can creep past in a bit more of an interesting way than just doing it in third person or first person. So it just makes the game feel a little bit fresh, and it introduces some new interesting mechanics. And that is indeed something that you can see throughout the game, which is a good thing. And then a little bit further on in the game, there's a mission called Barge, which for some reason feels like, at least to me, a rare era N64 mission with its verticality and use of environmental hazards like exploding barrels. And then before that, there's even a mission on a train called Montenegro Train. And then this is really where the 007 vibe peaks, and there's some interesting carriage-to-carriage combat, stealth, and despite some annoying difficulty spikes on this mission in particular when it comes to the highest difficulty settings, I think this is where the game really shines, and that 007 vibe really sort of speaks for itself. Now, because this was an Activision game that was crammed into less than a year of development, the filler missions are painfully obvious, and Sinkhole is probably the biggest offender here. It's a forgettable, blunt instrument of a mission where you just move between cover, taking out hordes of soldiers, and then Casino Poison, that's another really bad one, which is a nauseating first-person time trial with pretty much zero redeeming features. But perhaps the biggest wasted opportunity from the entire game is the Madagascar chase sequence, which is split into shantytown and construction site. It's an astonishing feat of engineering when you think about it, because it takes one of the best scenes from the film, or you could even argue in Bond history, and turns it into this pair of missions which are more or less dodgy interactive cutscenes, and entirely skips the embassy scene where he has a shootout, which is totally baffling because it's one of the biggest action scenes in the film and it's completely just not included in the game. Yet a chase sequence just before it is split between two missions, the first of which being some contrived action before you actually embark on the chase, and then the second of which is the interactive cutscene I mentioned. Now, this only really sort of dawned on me when I played it through for the second time more recently, because they completely omitted to include the embassy, which is a really big gunfight from the film, and then instead replaced it with this, which, like I said, is really confusing. Please make this make sense. I do not know why they did this. And then somewhere in the middle you've got the Science Center missions, which offer a pretty passable mix of sniping and claustrophobic corridor action, though they do seem a little bit cheap on the higher difficulties, especially when it comes to the boss fight, which is on the exterior mission of the two. Overall, though, I'd say that the casino missions are definitely the strongest part of the game, which is a good thing because, like I've already established, that's around 60% of the game. It's just a shame that the Quantum missions don't stack up in comparison because, like I've just discussed, the casino missions definitely do have their faults. By the time you reach the Venice Tailing mission and Echo Hotel, which is the finale, this is where the game goes back to the Quantum storyline and where the narrative incoherence really sets in, because Echo Hotel clearly had the biggest budget, featuring impressive set pieces and action that actually unfolds naturally rather than being contrived like it was in the construction site missions. You're essentially assaulting a compound to kill a boss, which makes sense. You're going to be fighting hordes of soldiers, which again makes sense. It unfolds naturally. But none of this crescendo really pays off because you've been playing a completely different story for the majority of the game. And this grand finale just kind of feels sudden, unearned, and not really part of the game. And this mission, although I think it's a pretty good mission, feels like a standalone and not earned at all, and it's the conclusion of the game which you kind of didn't play, which just makes the context all feel a little bit off. And one of the comments I said towards the start of the video is that this feels like two games pressed into one, and once you finish it, that sort of feeling really takes center stage, because this mission finishes the Quantum of Solace storyline like it does in the film, but you haven't really played the majority of the film in this game. You've been playing Casino. And again, like I said, if you're familiar with the films, that probably wouldn't be terrible, but as an overall cohesive product, which is a game, it definitely feels a little bit, shall we say, jarring and not well put together. Because while we do get a conclusion to the Casino storyline as well as the Quantum storyline, the way it's done via the flashbacks is just kind of a little bit ham-fisted, and it makes both of them feel a little bit either sudden or just not properly fleshed out, especially in the case of Quantum. You essentially have a half-told Quantum storyline mixed in with the middle section of Casino Royale and its ending, so neither of them really feel like they've been explored properly, and neither of them feel like it was a cohesive product. So although they're both technically complete, or at least have an ending point, neither of them feel finished, and that's the biggest problem the game has from a narrative perspective, at least. Alright then, now that I've essentially given you an abridged look at the whole game and its story, now's not a bad time to talk about some of the more sweeping observations when it comes to gameplay. Now, without stating the obvious, Quantum of Solace is not a long game, and even on the hardest difficulty, it took me around 5 hours to finish, and if you were doing this on regular, I suspect you might be able to blow through it even quicker, probably sub 4 hours, especially if you're familiar with it. The missions feel a bit randomly tacked together, like I've talked about, and they don't really do a great deal to remedy that with cutscenes which are littered throughout, usually in between each mission. In fact, most of the plot is delivered to you by these flat animations, which you couldn't really call cinematics. They're just uninspired little transitions where you just get fed some of the plot, and they mainly just hide the loading screens. It's a little bit, I don't know, uninspired and disappointing for a game which is based on a film. It's one of the most uncinematic things about the game, which is kind of ironic. But like I've also mentioned, most of the development of this game happened in less than a year, so perhaps it is okay to overlook some of the shortcomings like dodgy cinematics, dodgy pacing, and just marvel at the fact that they were able to put together anything which is coherent, let alone something I actually think has some degree of merit. Another part of the game which I think is a little bit lame is how you're punished or not so punished for breaking stealth. Typically it's clear when you're encouraged to keep it quiet, but none of these sections require it, and you can just shoot your way through everything if you choose to, which pretty well cheapens the encounters and undermines all of the skill of it, if you want to call it that. Because why would you bother sneaking around when you can just go loud and all you need to do is kill 4 more guys, who, by the way, usually come through the same door and can be dispatched almost instantly. And that's even on the highest difficulty, which is how I was playing it. It's basically no big deal to break stealth, and it's probably faster and more efficient to play like that, which undermines the whole vibe of James Bond, and you end up playing it more like a COD game, which is coincidentally the very engine that this game runs on, so it's not really doing itself any favors in regards to beating the COD clone allegations. But because it is based on the COD engine and made by Treyarch, the basic feel of the game is pretty good. But what holds it back from that is the fundamental inclusion of cover. It's absolutely necessary on the 007 difficulty, but when you play it on lower difficulties, you can really just blow through it like a more traditional Call of Duty game and totally dispense with the cover mechanic. And it leads to the game feeling a little bit like it has an identity crisis, because on one hand you've got this more measured, slow gameplay where you use cover, and you would probably associate that with a Bond game, but then that's built on top of what already exists as an FPS, and one indeed built with the tools which makes the most successful shooters ever. So it ends up feeling like 2 games melded into one, sort of in a similar way to how the story makes it feel. It's too much like COD to be Bond, but it's too much Bond to be like COD. So it depends entirely on how you play it, and maybe that's an example of extreme player agency, but more likely I think it's just a case of rushed development. I wouldn't even say that that ruins the game, but it does make it feel like a bit of a Frankenstein of design, which was later totally dispensed with when it comes to Activision's future games. Bloodstone went entirely third person, then GoldenEye Reloaded and Legends went down the more Call of Duty route, which in a way legitimizes the critique that Quantum doesn't properly find an identity and instead has this weird blend of both that's made even more obvious if you play the game on 2 different difficulties. I don't think it should be that I can play a game on Recruit and not touch cover at all, then play on 007 and have a totally different experience that almost never uses the first person perspective. And I'm well aware that that makes the game sound pretty unpolished and a characterless mess, but I do genuinely think that despite what I've just said, there's a good time to be had with it, and what it does well is enjoyable enough to warrant a session, and it's definitely worth a playthrough for fans of shooters, action games, and obviously Bond. And it's a weird game from an era where Activision didn't just make COD games, and they had their FPS studios doing new things like this, the other Bond games, and even Singularity. It's an artifact of a bygone era of games, and from that perspective, it almost becomes more compelling somehow. With all the obvious flaws aside, like the simple add-nothing hacking minigames and the dodgy QTEs, you've still got a game with full-breed FPS DNA in its veins, and on top of that, an oddly compelling third-person shooter, stealthy hybrid mix, which is sort of thrown in for good measure. It might not totally gel, and it might feel a bit clunky and at times run absolutely terribly, but somehow I find myself liking it, and I can't quite put my finger on why though. Perhaps it is just the nostalgia talking. For a game that sets out to fulfill being a Quantum of Solace tie-in, it basically fails in the one key area by not covering its namesake properly and instead padding the game length with scenes from the previous film, which is really odd, much like its design. But I don't think it makes the game bad, just a victim of misdirection. If the game were to lean into its identity as a Casino Royale game more and ditch the Quantum missions, I think we'd have a strong basis for two games that each feel distinct enough to stand alone. Obviously, Quantum would need a lot more content, but what it did have in this game was a solid start and an ending. They just needed gelling together a little bit more, and like I've said, the casino missions were some of the best in the game, so expanding on that for another game would have been more easy. It's just a shame that we got this weird mix of the two.